Hi everybody, welcome back to Intro to Biology for Majors, or BIOL 1224. This PowerPoint is going to cover Chapter 8 of your Openstax Biology 2E book, and Chapter 8 is about photosynthesis. So let's go ahead and get started. So as always, we're starting off with our objectives for this chapter. The first objective is to describe reactions vital to photosynthesis. The second is to identify cellular location, reactants, and products for the two stages of photosynthesis. And the third is to describe the energy cycle. And I do have a few vocabulary words. They're things that we've covered in the past, but I still just want to bring them up again to remind you. So we have ATP, or adenosine triphosphate. It's a high energy molecule that our cells use as an energy source. We've talked about it as being a currency between our cells. Basically, our body uses it in the form of energy. And then we have NADPH. It's a product of the first stage of photosynthesis, and it's actually used to help fuel reactions that take place in the second stage of photosynthesis. So we're going to go through that whole process and discuss it more, but I wanted you to know now what NADPH is. So this slide is going to cover photosynthesis as an overview, and it does cover a lot, so just bear with me. The first bullet point here says that it uses sunlight to power the synthesis of organic molecules. Energy for all life on Earth ultimately comes from the process of photosynthesis, because as we've talked about before, plants are considered producers. They produce energy, and we and other animals like us are considered consumers of that energy. So plants need few simple ingredients to make their own food. They need, or actually carbon dioxide and water are the reactants in photosynthesis. So in order for photosynthesis to take place, they need carbon dioxide, water, and sunlight. So we talked about knowing the reactants and the products of the chemical composition of photosynthesis. So this up here is the basic chemical equation for photosynthesis. So we have 6 carbon dioxides plus 6 water molecules plus light. So these are what we call, as always, the reactants. They're on the left side of that arrow. So if we're talking about addition, your arrow would be your equal sign, and these would be your products, right? So light yields glucose and oxygen. So this molecule here is glucose, and this is oxygen. So for the process of photosynthesis, your reactants would be the carbon dioxide, the water, and the light, and your products would be glucose or sugar and oxygen, which then we would use in our bodies, and we've talked about that before. We produce our energy from those things. So some of the notes that I have here are the molecules, once again, that are reactants in photosynthesis are water and carbon dioxide, because technically light is not a molecule. The molecules that are the products of photosynthesis are oxygen, and I have here carbohydrates. Glucose is a good example. It's what our body uses to make energy from plants. So I go a little bit more into the depth of the chemical equation. If you're curious in the notes, you can look at that. Once again, carbon dioxide and water are the products of respiration, and both of those enter into photosynthesis. So carbon dioxide and water would be our products. So we produce carbon dioxide and water while going through cellular respiration, which we discussed in previous chapters. And in photosynthesis, carbon dioxide and water yield glucose in the presence of light. And then in cellular respiration, which is what we do as animals, glucose is harvested for the production of ATP, and we release carbon dioxide and water. So when we breathe in, we breathe oxygen in from the plants. When we breathe out, we give them back carbon dioxide. So it's a synergistic process. We all gain something from that. Okay, so let's look a little bit more into how it works. And this is an interesting slide. This is some stuff you may have not heard of before. So the different pigments absorbing different wavelengths of light. So no pigment absorbs green light. That's something that you need to know. So the reason that plants come off green is because none of the pigments present in plants absorb that green light. So green light is then reflected, and that's why we perceive them to be green. So if you're looking at the image in the top right corner here that has the eyeball and the plant, these lines just represent different wavelengths of light. So we have red light, we have blue light, we have green light, and obviously the only light that was reflected back to us is green. And This situation is actually true in a way for all things, but right now I'm really just breaking down why we perceive plants as being green. So a photon is a unit of light. It's a particle of light. And the image down here talks about the next couple of bullet points that we have. So gas exchange at leaf pores called the stomata. So the stomata are these little guys you'll see here. It's an image that they generated. Very, very small pores, similar to the pores that we have on our body, on our face and everything like that. They're small openings on a plant leaf. They allow oxygen and carbon dioxide to flow without. So they allow oxygen in and carbon dioxide to go out. So yeah, once again, glucose and oxygen are the products of photosynthesis. So those molecules are entering and leaving through these stomata, so these little pores on the leaves of plants. So I've talked to you guys before about chloroplasts in plants and what they do. Let's get into it a little bit more and kind of break them down, open them up, and see what's inside. You guys will actually be able to see some chloroplasts in our lab that we're going to do about microscopes. So photosynthesis takes place in the chloroplasts of plants, which have an outer membrane, which you can see here. It's that outermost membrane. And they also have an inner membrane. So you see the darker color here indicates the inner membrane. And then what they have here that looks like stacks of coins, they have stacks of what these are. They're thylakoids. So they're called thylakoids. They contain pigments embedded in their membranes. So they come off as green. Chlorophyll is what is in those thylakoids. They're embedded in the thylakoids, the membranes, and they are the green color that you see. So within the thylakoids, there are chlorophyll. Those chlorophyll come off as that green color. And photons excite electrons in the chlorophyll molecule. So as light enters the plant, photons excite electrons and chlorophyll turns a green color. And also in here you have the stroma. It's this area, almost like a large vacuole within. So some of the notes that I have here, the chloroplast has an outer membrane and an inner membrane. Inside the inner membrane, like we said, are stacks of flattened discs called thylakoids. The actual stack itself, so a stack of thylakoids, is called a granum. Chlorophyll is within the thylakoid membrane. Green plant parts perform photosynthesis within the chloroplast, which is this whole thing. All green plants perform both photosynthesis and cellular respiration. So we, as animals, perform cellular respiration. Plants can actually do a little bit of both. Mushrooms, though, are an example of a plant that are not green, and they digest their food externally. So that's something we'll kind of get into in subsequent slides. But chlorophyll is the pigment that's vital to photosynthesis that is able to transfer the excited electrons. So there's a complex ring structure when it comes to chlorophyll, and with alternating double and single bonds, which is kind of the chemical makeup of what a chlorophyll molecule looks like. At the center of a chlorophyll ring is magnesium, and photons excite electrons in the ring. So light, which we talked about a photon being light, it excites those electrons within the ring, and it really makes the whole process happen. So in this slide, we're going to really talk about what we call the light reactions. And once again, this happens within those chloroplasts we just talked about. So the light reactions occur in the thylakoid membrane and require both water and light. ATP, which is the energy molecule that we use, and NADPH are produced. Oxygen gas is actually a byproduct, which is what we take in. So that oxygen gas that plants produce is a byproduct. Inside the thylakoid, the photosystems are part of an electron transport chain that converts light energy into ATP and NADPH. So it converts light energy into the forms of energy that our bodies can use. So in the notes section, I have that this is kind of talking about step one of photosynthesis, would be the light reactions. And how it works is that light strikes a plant leaf and photons are absorbed by a photosystem embedded in the thylakoid membrane. So light is absorbed within those thylakoid membrane. Light energy is bounced from those chlorophyll within the thylakoids to other chlorophyll until it reaches the reaction center of chlorophyll, which is able to transfer the excited electrons from the light to the primary electron acceptor. These electrons come from split water molecules and go to primary electron acceptors in very high energy state. So the primary electron acceptor then sends the electrons through the electron transport chain, which we've talked about previously, very similar to the one used in our mitochondria. And the electron transport chain process generates that ATP, which is then used for the next part of the cycle, which is called the Calvin cycle. So the light reactions is the first part, or the first step to photosynthesis, and then our next slide is going to cover the Calvin cycle. So plants have to go through the life cycle, or the light cycle first, in order to produce the ATP, the energy that they need to go through the next part, the Calvin cycle. So you all may have heard of the Calvin cycle before. We're actually going to dig into it a little bit more now, and this image is a really good one to kind of break down what we've covered so far in photosynthesis and what we're now going to talk about. So this would be a chloroplast that we're looking at. Like we talked about, they need light. The light will then enter that thylakoid membrane where those chlorophyll sit, right? What turns plants green. It will take in water, it will produce as a byproduct oxygen, and then within the process they're making ATP and NADPH. So these items are coming from the Calvin cycle. The thylakoids are then producing ATP and NADPH. So at this point we've covered all the way through that energy process, and now we're going to talk about the Calvin cycle. So it's the next step in photosynthesis, the second step. So the Calvin cycle produces carbohydrates, which we've talked about as an example, glucose. So carbon reactions use carbon dioxide, or CO2, and they produce sugars like glucose. So in the carbon reactions, the chloroplast will use the ATP and NADPH produced in the light reactions. So like we said, the light reactions have to happen first to make this ATP and NADPH, these energy molecules that then enter the Calvin cycle. So how it works: the Calvin cycle happens in the stroma. So we discussed the stroma when we looked into chloroplast. It's that almost vacuole area, the open area within the chloroplast. So that is where the Calvin cycle takes place. CO2, or carbon dioxide, from the atmosphere undergoes carbon fixation. NADPH from the light reactions drops off hydrogens, which are added to the molecule that is closer to becoming a carbohydrate. So they're added to that new sugar molecule. ATP that was generated during the light reactions powers all of the reactions in the Calvin cycle. So like we said, ATP is that currency energy that the plant's chloroplast is using to create these sugars that it wants. So Calvin cycle happens, like we said, in the stroma of the chloroplast to convert carbon dioxide into a carbohydrate or a sugar. So stromata, we talked about before, those tiny pores. They're tiny openings or leaf pores that open and close to allow for gas exchange. So some plants have evolved alternate methods of photosynthesis, which are called C3 and C4 photosynthesis. And I'm going to say the acronym here, CAM. You guys can look at the words if you want to in your notes section. That's another type of photosynthesis. These alternate methods allow the plants to survive in extreme climates. So they survive in very dry or hot climates, for example. So these CAM plants actually keep the stomata open at night. So that gas exchange happens at night to then avoid the extreme temperatures and environments the plants are in. Okay, so we're already to our summary of photosynthesis. So it really only has two major parts that you all need to know about. So it has the light reactions and then the Calvin cycle. So in summary, photosynthesis forms an energy cycle with the process of cellular respiration. So like we said, photosynthesis and cellular respiration both take place in plants. Animals like us only go through cellular respiration. Plants need both photosynthesis and respiration for their ability to function in both the light and the dark, and to be able to interconvert essential metabolites. So basically to be able to produce their own foods and keep themselves alive, they have to have the option to do both photosynthesis in the light and then cellular respiration in the dark, because photosynthesis requires light. So they wouldn't be able to make it without both. Plants must contain both chloroplasts and mitochondria, because if you think this through, chloroplast is where the photosynthesis process takes place, while the mitochondria, much like in our bodies, is where their cellular respiration will take place. So in the notes, I have, once again, the chemical equation for the process of photosynthesis here. So you have 6 CO2 or carbon dioxide plus 6 H2O or water molecules plus light will then equal or produce glucose and oxygen. So that is the simplified chemical equation for photosynthesis, and we'll kind of go over this in lab to really make sure everybody understands. It's a really easy equation to kind of memorize because you all already know the things that go into photosynthesis and what comes out of photosynthesis. So once you know that, it's easy to kind of memorize the equation. So the reactants are on the left side of the arrow and the products are on the right, as always. And I do want to mention again, this is very important, that all life depends on photosynthesis. So now we have reached our key takeaways. So we have 4 here. The first being photosynthesis includes light-dependent reactions and the Calvin cycle. The second being the reactants of photosynthesis are carbon dioxide and water. You can also include light because it is required, but it's really not a molecule. So it's really carbon dioxide and water are your reactants on the left side of that arrow. And then your products are glucose and oxygen. Light is required for the reactions to begin. So then the third would be light-dependent reactions occur across the thylakoid membrane of the chloroplast, producing ATP, or that energy molecule. The Calvin cycle uses carbon dioxide to produce sugars in the stroma and requires ATP. So it produces those sugars that we need as consumers, and that happens in the stroma or the vacuole kind of empty area of those chloroplast molecules. So photosynthesis then consumes CO2 and produces O2, or consumes carbon dioxide and produces oxygen, while cellular respiration, in the presence of oxygen, does the exact opposite. So in the presence of oxygen, cellular respiration will take in the oxygen and produce the CO2. And then photosynthesis, the plants will take in the CO2 and produce the oxygen. So it's a really perfect system. So that's really the end of our Chapter 8 slideshow. If you all have any questions, please follow up with me, and then go ahead and move on to Chapter 9. They kind of go together. They're both very short chapters. So yeah, just move on to Chapter 9 and try to finish that one subsequently to this one. Thanks.